Top 20 Most Haunted Places in Virginia with 60 real stories. Subscribe Blink News, like this video, and let's get started. Number 1. Aquia Church, Stafford. On a quiet hill in Stafford County, Virginia stands a brick church that has seen everything: war, disease, betrayal, and death. Built before America was even a country, Aquia Church is still open for Sunday service. But when the organ is silent and the congregation has gone home, something else walks its aisles. Witnesses have heard whispers in the empty sanctuary, seen soldiers in faded blue uniforms patrolling the churchyard, and on rare nights, caught sight of a pale woman in a white dress lingering near the altar, staring as if she's waiting for someone. Tonight, we're going to peel back the centuries and step into the shadows of one of Virginia's most haunted landmarks. But first, you have to understand the ground you're standing on. History of Aquia Church. The story begins in 1751 when the people of Overwarden Parish decided they needed a larger place of worship. The land they chose was strategic, high ground, visible for miles, safe from the frequent flooding that plagued the lowlands. They hired two master builders, Morning Richards and William Copain, who designed something unusual for the time: a Greek cross layout. 4 equal arms, each lined with tall windows, and in the center a soaring open space beneath a pitched roof. It was a statement of both faith and permanence. The bricks were hand-fired from local clay, the trim carved from the creamy sandstone quarried at nearby Aquia Creek, the same stone that would later be used in the construction of the White House. By 1755, the church was almost complete, and then disaster struck. Just days before it was to open, a mysterious fire gutted the nearly finished structure. Some whispered it was sabotage, others blamed carelessness, but no culprit was ever found. Undeterred, the parishioners rebuilt. 2 years later, in 1757, Aquia Church finally opened its doors. Inside, the wooden pews gleamed with fresh varnish. The pulpit stood elevated for all to see, and sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the plaster walls. The church quickly became a focal point of the community. Families came not just to worship, but to gossip, trade goods, and discuss politics. Among those who likely passed through its doors were Revolutionary War figures like George Mason, and perhaps even Thomas Jefferson traveling between estates. Then came the Civil War. Stafford County's position between Washington, D.C. and Richmond made it a crossroads for armies. By late 1862, Union forces occupied the area, and Aquia Church was seized for use as a field hospital. Its pews were ripped out to make space for rows of cots, blood soaked into the floorboards. Soldiers moaned through the night as surgeons worked under flickering lanterns. When the fighting moved on, some of the wounded never left. They were buried in the churchyard, their graves marked with simple wooden crosses that have long since rotted away. The building itself bore scars, initials carved into the walls by bored soldiers, musket ball holes in the bricks. After the war, the congregation slowly returned. The church was repaired, repainted, and reopened, but those who came back swore the air inside had changed. It felt heavier, as if the place remembered. Story 1. Blonde Beth, the most famous legend tied to Aquia Church, doesn't come from a soldier, but from a woman known only as Blonde Beth. According to local lore, sometime in the early 1800s, a young woman traveling alone stopped in Stafford County on her way north. She was wealthy, carrying a small fortune in jewelry and coin. But one night, as she made her way toward a tavern near the church, she was attacked by 2 highwaymen. Desperate, she ran toward the only light she could see, Aquia Church. She pounded on the vestry door, screaming for help, but the men caught her before anyone could answer. They dragged her inside, perhaps thinking it was abandoned at night, and in the struggle they killed her. The killers hid her body beneath the vestry floorboards. Months passed before the smell gave her away. Her remains were buried in the churchyard, but no headstone marks her grave. For over 2 centuries, parishioners have reported seeing a tall, pale woman with long blonde hair standing in the vestry window after dark. Sometimes she paces, as if waiting to escape again. Other times, she stares out toward the road, her eyes searching for help that never came. One custodian in the 1980s swore he heard footsteps upstairs while locking up one evening. Thinking someone had been left behind, he called out, no answer. When he climbed the stairs, the footsteps stopped. The vestry was empty, but as he turned to leave, he caught sight of her reflection in the window, a woman in white, her face gaunt, her hair like a curtain of gold. When he spun around, there was no one there. Story 2. The soldiers who never left during the Civil War. dozens of men died inside Aquia Church. Some were buried nearby, others carted off to larger cemeteries. But not all of them seem to have moved on. In the quiet hours before dawn, visitors have reported seeing figures in faded blue uniforms standing among the headstones. They don't speak. They don't move. And if you try to approach, they simply vanish. One of the most detailed accounts comes from the early 2000s. A local historian was photographing the churchyard for a book. He arrived just after sunrise, the grass wet with dew. As he lined up a shot of the old sandstone wall, he noticed a man leaning on a musket watching him. The historian assumed it was a reenactor. Civil War buffs sometimes posed for tourists. But as he adjusted his lens, he realized he could see the wall through the man. The figure turned, walked toward a cluster of graves, and disappeared into thin air. Inside the church, EVP, electronic voice, phenomenon. Recordings have picked up faint murmurs, prayers, orders barked in military cadence, the clink of metal canteens. One recording from a paranormal investigation in 2012 captured what sounded like a young man saying, "Tell my mother I'm warm now." Chilling words, given that many of the soldiers here died from exposure during the brutal winter of 1862 to 63. Story 3. The light in the vestry. The vestry is a small side room in Aquia Church, used for storing vestments and preparing for service. It has no electricity, and yet multiple people have reported seeing a soft, flickering light inside long after the building is locked. In the mid-1990s, two Civil War reenactors camping nearby decided to walk past the church one night. As they approached, they saw a golden light glowing through the vestry window. Thinking it might be an open house or night service, they knocked on the door. No one answered. They circled the building, peering through windows. The light was there one moment, gone the next. Later they learned from the pastor that the vestry had no lighting at all. Some believe it's the spirit of Blonde Beth, still trying to guide someone to her hiding place. Others think it's a soldier's lantern, carried forever through the dark. One modern twist. In 2019, a couple taking wedding photos at the church captured something strange. In the background of one image, in the vestry window, a pale face looks out, and just beside it a faint, golden glow. The photographer swore no one was in the building that day. Aquia Church has stood for over 260 years, weathering fire, war, and loss. It remains a place of worship, but it's also something more. A silent witness to every joy and tragedy that's passed through its doors. And if the stories are true, some of those souls never left. Next time you're driving through Stafford County, you might see the church rising on the hill, its brick walls glowing in the late afternoon sun. But if you pass after dark, you may see another light, a flicker in the vestry, a face in the window, and maybe, just maybe, the past reaching out to remind you it's still here. Number 2. Roswell Plantation Ruins, Gloucester. On the banks of the York River, deep in Gloucester County, Virginia, there is a place where time itself seems to hold its breath. Massive brick chimneys stretch into the sky like skeletal fingers. Grass grows where grand parlors once echoed with music. The wind moves through open archways, carrying whispers from 3 centuries ago. This is Roswell, or what's left of it. Once the grandest mansion in colonial America, it burned to the ground more than 100 years ago. But those who have walked among its ruins at night say the fire didn't drive everyone out. Some claim you can still hear footsteps on staircases that no longer exist, or see the silhouette of a woman in a red cloak hurrying toward a rose garden that burned away in 1916. Before we step into the ruins, we have to step back in time, to when Roswell was more than stone and shadow. In 1725, Colonel Man Page I, a wealthy landowner and politician, decided to build a home that would rival the governor's palace in Williamsburg. He envisioned a mansion so large and refined that it would be talked about for generations. He chose a site overlooking the York River, high enough to catch the breeze, and ordered shiploads of English brick and slate to be brought in. Construction took years, a monumental task in the 18th century. When Man Page I died in 1730, the project passed to his son, Man Page II, who spared no expense. By the time it was completed in 1733, Roswell was a marvel, 3 stories high, more than 12,000 square feet of living space, with 24 rooms, 9 massive chimneys, and ceilings painted with intricate designs. The Flemish Bond brickwork, imported slate roof, and tall sash windows made it one of the most sophisticated homes in America. The Pages filled the mansion with fine furniture, crystal chandeliers, and imported carpets. Roswell became a center of Virginia high society. Balls, political gatherings, and lavish dinners filled the Great Hall. Among its notable guests was Thomas Jefferson, a close friend and college classmate of John Page, grandson of the builder. There is a persistent local legend that Jefferson drafted portions of the Declaration of Independence while visiting Roswell. But grandeur has a cost. The plantation's wealth was built on enslaved labor. And by the 1800s, the tides of fortune began to turn. The Civil War devastated Virginia's economy, and the Page family's resources dwindled. Maintaining such an enormous home became nearly impossible. By the late 19th century, Roswell's glory had faded. Parts of the interior were dismantled and sold. The grand staircase creaked under fewer and fewer footsteps. Still, the building stood, proud, weathered, stubborn. Then, in 1916, tragedy struck. A fire, likely sparked by a chimney or oil lamp, tore through the mansion. The flames devoured the wooden floors and roof, sending glowing embers into the night sky. By morning, all that remained were the brick walls, the towering chimneys, and fragments of its once great windows. The ruins became part of local lore. In 1979, the property was donated to the Gloucester Historical Society, and today visitors can walk the grounds. The official story is one of history and preservation. But the unofficial story, whispered by locals and ghost hunters alike, is that Roswell never truly emptied. Story 1. The Woman on the Steps. It was a late summer evening when a couple from Richmond decided to stop by the Roswell ruins on their way home from the Outer Banks. The site was closed, but the chain-link gate didn't stop them from peering in. The sun was low, painting the broken chimneys gold. Then, from the shadows of what had once been the front entrance, they saw movement. A woman stepped into view. She was tall, dressed in a long gown, and her dark hair was swept up in an old-fashioned style. Without looking at them, she began to descend the wide brick steps that led down from the entrance. Steps that even then were half-broken and overgrown. The couple froze. Something about the woman seemed off. Her gown shimmered slightly, as though lit from within. When she reached the bottom step, she turned toward the road and vanished. Shaken, the couple hurried back to their car. But as they started the engine, they saw something even stranger. A black sedan parked sideways across the exit road, blocking their path. Its headlights were off, and its chrome bumper gleamed faintly in the fading light. The license plate was bright yellow, and the numbers didn't match any format they recognized. Later, the man would swear they looked like plates from the 1930s. They blinked, and the car was gone. No sound of an engine. No taillights disappearing down the road, just an empty lane back to the highway. Story 2. Music in the ruins in the early 2000s. A group of local college students visited the ruins at night. They brought flashlights and a digital recorder, hoping to capture something paranormal. The air was warm and still as they crossed the grass toward the main structure. The brick walls loomed above them, black against the sky. They set the recorder on a low wall and began calling out questions. "Is anyone here with us?" one asked. For a moment, there was only the chirp of crickets. Then, faintly, they heard it. Music. It was delicate, lilting, like a harpsichord being played in another room. The notes drifted on the air, weaving between the columns. One of the students thought it was a prank, that someone had hidden a speaker nearby. But the music didn't sound modern. It was imperfect, with pauses and slight hesitations, as though played by human hands. They followed the sound toward the east wall. As they stepped through a gap in the bricks, the music stopped. In the silence that followed, they all felt it, a sudden drop in temperature, so sharp it made their breath mist in the air. Then came the footsteps, light, measured, descending an invisible staircase. A shadow moved across the ground where no walls stood, and just beyond, in the moonlight, a woman in a red cloak swept past them, her skirts brushing the grass. She vanished behind a chimney that no longer connected to any roof. When the students checked the recorder later, they found something that made their skin crawl. The harpsichord music was there, but so was a voice. Soft, feminine, and close to the microphone. It said, "You're early for the ball." Story 3. The cellar voices. Beneath the ruins lies a cellar once used to store wine and food for the mansion's guests. Today, it's little more than a pit lined with brick, its floor littered with leaves and debris. In 2011, a paranormal investigation team from Norfolk visited the site after dark. 2 members descended into the cellar while the others stayed above, monitoring EMF meters and cameras. At first, it was quiet. Then, one of the investigators in the cellar heard whispering. It was faint, like a conversation in the next room. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, almost panicked. She turned to her partner to ask if he heard it. And that's when they both saw it, faint scratch marks along the cellar walls, as though someone had clawed at the bricks. A cold breeze swirled through the pit, carrying the smell of smoke. Then from the far corner, a shape emerged, the silhouette of a young girl no more than 10 years old. She wore a red dress, her hair pulled back with a ribbon. She didn't move. She didn't speak. The investigators froze. One of them whispered, "Hello?" The girl tilted her head and vanished. When they climbed out of the cellar, the rest of the team said their EMF meters had spiked violently at the exact moment the girl appeared. One member, looking pale, asked if they had smelled smoke down there. When they nodded, he said, "We smelled it up here too." Number 3. Weems Botts Museum, Dumfries, Virginia. Today, it's a quiet little town where the Potomac River drifts by, and the roads are lined with historic buildings that look almost too perfect, like they belong in an old painting. But if you turn off Main Street and walk just a block or two toward the waterfront, you'll find a small, two-story building made of weathered wood and red brick. From the outside, it doesn't look like much. In fact, you might mistake it for just another quaint colonial home. But this is the Weems Botts Museum. And for more than 2.5 centuries, this building has been a witness to war, tragedy, illness, and if you believe the stories, more than a few restless spirits. It all started in 1749, when a merchant named Benjamin Botts built the structure as a simple home and store. Back then, Dumfries wasn't just a quiet little river town. It was one of the busiest ports in all of Virginia, rivaling Alexandria in shipping traffic. Tobacco rolled down from inland farms, packed into barrels, and sent overseas. Merchants like Botts grew wealthy, and their homes became both businesses and social centers. But the Weems Botts building didn't stay in the hands of one family. Over the decades it passed from merchant to merchant, eventually being purchased by the Reverend Mason Locke Weems. Yes, that Parson Weems, the man famous for writing the story of young George Washington chopping down a cherry tree. Weems sold books out of the front room, preached from nearby pulpits, and filled the town's imagination with tales of American virtue. And then came the Revolutionary War. Dumfries was strategically important, not just for shipping, but for moving troops and supplies. Soldiers passed through, some stayed in town and others never left. Disease swept through Dumfries in the 1700s, claiming soldiers and civilians alike. The Weems Botts house, like many in the town, became a makeshift infirmary. People who fell ill here often didn't recover. After the war, the building changed hands again, this time becoming the home of Benjamin Botts, a lawyer whose name is still tied to one of the most infamous cases in American history, the defense of Aaron Burr in his treason trial. But tragedy found him too. In 1811, Botts died in the Richmond Theater fire, a disaster that claimed more than 70 lives. Over the years, the home endured cycles of prosperity and decay. By the 20th century, it had been a private residence, a store, and eventually a museum. And through it all, people kept reporting strange things: footsteps in empty rooms, laughter where no one was standing, and glimpses of figures that dissolved into thin air. Now, the Weems Botts Museum is carefully preserved for visitors, but if you step inside, you may walk out believing that not everyone here is resting in peace. Story 1. The Child in the Attic. The first story comes from a museum staff member named Elaine, who had worked there for nearly a decade. One summer afternoon, she was leading a small tour group through the building. It was quiet. Only 3 visitors, all older women from out of state. She led them through the ground floor, pointing out the period furniture, old documents, and paintings. When the tour reached the narrow staircase that leads to the attic, Elaine warned them. The stairs are steep, so hold onto the railing. They climbed slowly, the wooden steps creaking under their weight. The attic was dim, lit only by 2 small windows, but you could see the exposed beams and the small cot pushed against the far wall. Elaine explained that this space had once been used for storage and possibly for children's sleeping quarters in the late 1700s. One of the women wandered toward the cot and froze. She tilted her head slightly and whispered, "Do you hear that?" At first, Elaine thought maybe she meant the wind, which sometimes whistled through the old window frames. But then she heard it too. A faint giggle. High-pitched. Playful. Elaine scanned the room. The 3 visitors were all in front of her. No one else in sight. The giggle came again, this time from the far corner near a pile of old trunks. One of the women swore she saw movement, just the faintest flicker, like a child darting behind a trunk. But when Elaine walked over and pulled one of the trunks away from the wall, there was nothing. They left the attic quickly, and Elaine tried to brush it off. But later, she learned something that made her stomach tighten. Back in the early 1800s, a young girl had died in this house from an unknown illness. She'd been quarantined in the attic to protect the rest of the family, and some believe she still lingers there, laughing softly at the strangers who wander into her space. Story 2. The Woman in the Blue Dress. The second story comes from a local historian named Robert, who was cataloging artifacts in the museum one evening after hours. It was January, the air outside bitterly cold, and the museum was closed to the public. He was alone, or at least he thought he was. Robert was working in the front parlor when he heard the soft rustle of fabric from the hallway. It sounded like someone wearing a long skirt brushing against the walls as they walked. He called out, thinking maybe another staff member had come in unexpectedly. No answer. The sound moved toward the front door, then stopped. Robert stepped into the hall, and there she was. A woman standing with her back to him, wearing a long blue dress that looked like something out of the mid-1800s. Her dark hair was pinned up, and she stood perfectly still. "Ma'am?" Robert asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She turned her head slightly, just enough for him to catch a pale cheek and the outline of her jaw, and then, in less than a second, she was gone. Not gone as in walked away, gone as in dissolved into the air. Robert later found an old portrait in the museum archives. It showed a woman from the mid-19th century, same blue dress, same hairstyle. She'd been the wife of a merchant who once lived in the house, and according to local records, she died suddenly, possibly from cholera, in that very hallway. Story 3, The Shutting Door. The third story is more recent, from a pair of tourists who visited the museum in 2017. They were exploring the upstairs bedrooms, taking photos, when they both heard the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs behind them. Assuming it was another tour group, they moved to the side to make room. But no one appeared. Instead, the bedroom door, which had been propped open with a small wooden wedge, slammed shut with such force that the wedge shot across the floor. Startled, they tried the handle, but the door wouldn't open. They pounded and called out for help until a staff member came up from below. The strange part: from the hallway side, the door wasn't locked. The staff member simply turned the handle and opened it. Later, when they checked their phones, the couple noticed something else. One of their photos, taken just seconds before the door slammed, showed a faint shadow standing in the corner of the room. The outline looked like a person, but it was blurred, almost transparent. Some believe this is the same spirit that slams doors throughout the house. A former resident who died here, still determined to control who comes and goes. Number 4. Graffiti House, Brandy Station. There's a modest 2-story house standing just beside the railroad tracks in Brandy Station, Virginia. At first glance, it's easy to dismiss it as another old building, unremarkable, quiet. But inside, the plaster walls on the second floor are filled with scrawled names, hastily drawn horses, soldiers' quips, and signatures of men who stood where we stand now, during a war that nearly broke the nation. This is the Graffiti House. It was built in 1858, just years before the Civil War tore through this region. During the conflict, both Confederate and Union forces used it sometimes as headquarters, sometimes as a field hospital. When the fighting paused, soldiers recuperating within its walls scratched their names and stories into the very plaster of the building. But soldiers didn't just leave graffiti. Over the years, visitors and investigators have reported something else. Shadows of soldiers pacing empty rooms, muffled moans drifting through the halls, and EVPs captured phrases spoken long ago, left echoing in audio recordings. Tonight, we're walking straight into that echo. The story begins around 1858, when a 2-story frame house was erected along Brandy Road just beside the Orange and Alexandria Railroad tracks. It likely served a dual purpose, a home and possibly a small commercial establishment. When the Civil War arrived, the house's location made it strategically valuable. During the First Battle of Bull Run, 1st Manassas, in 1861, wounded Confederate soldiers were brought here for care. When the largest cavalry battle in North America swept through the region, in June 1863, the Battle of Brandy Station, the house became a field hospital. Union troops later occupied it during the winter encampment of 1863-64, even using it as headquarters under General Henry Prince. Soldiers on both sides left their marks. Names, units, sketches of horses, quips like Yanks caught hell, and one of the most famous being the Maryland Scroll, which lists 14 names from Breathed's battery written on March 16, 1863, before they marched into the Battle of Kelly's Ford. Graffiti nearly disappeared under layers of wallpaper and paint, until a 1993 renovation revealed these voices from the past etched on the walls. In 2002, the Brandy Station Foundation purchased and restored the house. Today it stands as both a museum of its graffiti and a gateway into history. The building is recognized on both the Virginia Landmarks Register and the National Register of Historic Places for its unique and extensive Civil War graffiti collection. Story 1, The Tightening Grip. In 2007, the Virginia Paranormal Institute held an overnight investigation at the Graffiti House. One of the lead investigators, Jackie Hicks, climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor alone. As she ran her fingers over the graffiti-laden walls, she felt something brush her wrist like a tightening grip, a pressure that felt unbearably focused. Downstairs, the journalist Donnie Johnston captured something stranger. He watched in horror as a heavy picture frame slowly slid across a shelf and fell to the floor by itself. At the same time, ghost-detecting meters, EMF, and motion detectors were racing off the charts, indicating intense, unexplained activity. Not wind, not vibrations. Something or someone was very present. They left that night with more than data. They carried stories and uneasy chills that lingered far longer than any equipment could measure. Story 2, Voices Between the Scrawls. On another investigation, a paranormal team set up EVPs in the upstairs hall. They asked simple questions. Can you tell us your name? Where did you fight? Do you remember this place? Later, when reviewing recordings, they discovered responses. Whispered phrases emerging from silence. Names called softly, units, military jargon that didn't belong to any actor or tour guide. As the team listened, one voice uttered, "I'm still here." During tours narrated by colonial ghosts, visitors and investigators also reported that dust motes above certain pieces of graffiti would ripple like the air vibrating just above a drawing, or a figure in charcoal seeming to shimmer in candlelight. In that hall, between the scribbles of soldiers who had barely survived battle, it sometimes feels like they're answering through time itself. Story 3. Soldier Shadows. In the hall, visitors often whisper about glimpsing phantom figures drifting past the walls. During quiet hours, some have felt a presence nearing them, just behind, walking past in uniform, silent, stepping across creaking floorboards that no longer support anything. One guest, photographing the second-floor graffiti, captured their flash illuminating the dancing lady chalk drawing only to glimpse a blurred human outline reflected off the opposite wall. When they whispered, "Did you see that?" a faint moan echoed back. No one else was in the room. It's not singular events either. Multiple investigators confirm hearing footsteps pacing in unison above them, like soldiers continuing a ghostly drill, or standing still just out of frame, visible only in their peripheral vision. The coldness in the air, sharp, biting, sometimes lingers after the figure recedes. Number 5. Historic Jordan Springs, Stevenson. Imagine standing in the faded elegance of a grand ballroom. Sunlight filters through antique windows, highlighting ornate woodwork and the polish of well-worn floors. But just beyond the present, there lies a past drenched in both hope and sorrow. This is historic Jordan Springs, sitting quietly in Stevenson. Once a vibrant resort built around healing sulfur springs, it became a sanctuary in times of war, until the walls themselves seemed to absorb every pain and farewell. Today they whisper. Visitors report sudden chills in warm rooms, hear whispered voices in lonely hallways, and some say the basement doesn't just echo, it reacts. Essence of the past seems to drift here, and tonight, we're stepping inside its shadows. Long before the resort's rise, local Native Americans revered the white sulfur springs here for their healing qualities. By the early 1800s, the Jordan family, including Branch M. Jordan and later Edwin C. Jordan, transformed those sacred waters into a luxury retreat. The first white sulfur springs resort thrived in the early 1800s. Years later, in 1855, a larger hotel rose to accommodate even greater demand. Then the Civil War arrived. As Union and Confederate forces passed through and battles raged, the resort's elegant halls were repurposed, becoming a hospital for the wounded. Soldiers suffering from fever and gunshot wounds were tended to in what had once hosted summer retreats. When they died, many were buried on the property, their bodies later reinterred after the war. During the war's chaos, Confederate General Edward Allegheny Johnson stopped here for directions amidst the Second Battle of Winchester, using the estate's grounds strategically. Soldiers paused for breakfast afterward, stepping into the breakfast halls now soaked with both hospitality and dread. The resort languished in post-war years, its fortunes fading as competition and changing tastes diminished patronage. The hotel buildings burned, were repurposed by missionaries in the mid-20th century, and even housed a seminary and rehab center from 1953 until 1999. Today it stands as the historic Jordan Springs Event and Cultural Center, hosting weddings and conferences, and bearing a reputation as one of Virginia's most authenticated paranormal sites. Story 1. The Portal of Spirits. John Rossi, lead investigator for Shenandoah Shadows, has conducted paranormal investigations at Jordan Springs since 2008, calling it the most EVP-active location I have ever been in. He's recorded voices that he believes belong to a wide range of spirits: Native Americans, Civil War soldiers, nurses, and children from different eras. Some investigators even describe the place as a portal between worlds. In the main attic, a favorite spot for ghost hunters and paranormal teams, visitors often hear something unexpected: a child's giggle. One investigator asked, "Do you want to play hide and seek?" Moments later, a clear, tiny voice answered, "Seek." Another investigator, exploring later that night, heard multiple voices calling out, some in recognizable English, others murmured in a language possibly Native American, especially near the old grotto area. It's said to be the site of spiritual ceremony, used by indigenous peoples long before the resort existed. Story 2. Aggression in the attic. On one investigation by the Twisted Paranormal Society, team members entered the attic only to be met with aggressive activity. Doors slammed, unseen footsteps closed in, and investigators reported growls and heavy breathing, a sharp contrast to the playful child's laughter. They said it felt angry, as if something in the room objected to their presence. Those who stayed elsewhere on the estate couldn't hear the sounds, but upstairs, the attic seemed alive and very unhappy.
Story 3. Voices in the Card Room. And Grotto 1. Visit by DC Metro Area Ghost Watchers. DCMAG led to unsettling EVP results in the card room, where common words like officer, outside, holiday, and even Emma appeared seemingly generated by spirit activity through electromagnetic devices. Some investigators even heard the name John Brown whispered among responses. In the grotto, a low-lit, damp cave near the sulfur spring, investigators report not only cold spots, but strange audio phenomena. At times, EVPs have captured Native American languages, lending credibility to the idea that this ground holds multiple layers of spiritual resonance.
Number 6. Peyton Randolph House, Williamsburg. Tucked into the cobblestone streets of colonial Williamsburg stands a brick-red, two-story Georgian house that draws your gaze not for its grandeur, but for something more unsettling. It's the Peyton Randolph House, one of the oldest structures in the town, built in 1715. Step inside after dark or even near closing, and you might feel a cold weight on your shoulder, as though history itself has caught up. In one room, you'll hear whispers from empty corridors. In another, the creak of heavy boots that never belonged to the present. Shadowy figures drift by, and a young soldier paces with purpose, but no one alive is walking with him.
Built in 1715, the Peyton Randolph House is one of the oldest and most storied structures in Williamsburg, Virginia. Its namesake, Peyton Randolph, was a prominent revolutionary leader, president of the First and Second Continental Congresses, and a man deeply entrenched in colonial politics. The house witnessed more than just the hum of political conversation. It was the backdrop for personal tragedy, violent deaths, and a shadow of misfortune that seemed to cling to its occupants. During the American Revolution, soldiers passed through, some staying as guests, others brought in wounded. Over the centuries, it served as a home, a boarding house, and even lodging for students at the College of William and Mary. With every passing decade, the property's history deepened, but so did the stories of strange and disturbing occurrences. Many visitors claim the house feels charged, as though centuries of unrest are still echoing through the floorboards. Story 1. The pacing soldier. In the mid-20th century, a security guard assigned to the house during restoration work began hearing the sound of footsteps above him late at night. They were slow, measured, and deliberate, as if someone in boots was walking the length of the upstairs hall. At first, he thought it was another worker, but after calling out and getting no answer, he climbed the staircase. Halfway up, the steps stopped. He reached the top landing and saw nothing. As he turned to go back down, the footsteps started again directly behind him. Spinning around, he caught a fleeting glimpse of a man in a faded Revolutionary War uniform, head down, hands clasped behind his back, pacing slowly as if deep in thought. In an instant, the figure vanished, leaving only silence and the faint smell of gunpowder. Story 2. The unseen dinner guest. One evening in the late 1980s, a colonial Williamsburg interpreter was hosting a small after-hours event in the dining room of the Peyton Randolph house. As she set the table, she felt a sudden drop in temperature, like a cold draft sweeping through the closed room. Without warning, a chair pulled itself out at the far end of the table, the wood scraping loudly against the floor. Then the seat pressed down slightly as though an invisible figure had just sat. The interpreter froze, holding a candlestick. Then came the unmistakable sound of silverware clinking, like someone quietly cutting into a meal. She backed out of the room and refused to re-enter until morning. The next day, the chair was still pulled away from the table, and a single antique spoon had been moved from its setting, sitting at the empty place where the ghostly guest had eaten. Story 3. The lady in blue. A tourist in the early 2000s claimed she was wandering upstairs when she saw a woman standing in the corner of a bedroom, dressed in a pale blue colonial gown. The woman's head was tilted down, and she appeared to be quietly weeping. The tourist called out, thinking she had stumbled into a costumed guide, but the woman didn't respond. Instead, she turned slightly, revealing a hollow-eyed, almost translucent face, her tears leaving no trace on her cheeks. The moment their eyes met, the woman dissolved into thin air. Later research revealed that in the 18th century, a young female relative of Peyton Randolph had died unexpectedly in that very room after a sudden illness took her within hours. Some believe the lady in blue is her spirit forever grieving a life cut short. Number 7. St. Albans Sanatorium, Radford. Perched on a hill overlooking the New River, St. Albans has a long, unsettling history that predates its construction. The site was once the scene of brutal civil war battles, the surrounding hills echoing with cannon fire and musket blasts. In 1892, a wealthy businessman built the St. Albans Lutheran Boys' School here, intended to be a prestigious institution. Instead, it gained a reputation for severe bullying and psychological torment among students, some of whom never left alive. By 1916, the building was converted into a psychiatric sanatorium. This was an era when mental health treatment was often cruel and experimental. Electroshock therapy, insulin coma therapy, and prolonged isolation were common. Countless patients died, some by suicide, others under mysterious circumstances. With over a century of violence, trauma, and tragedy embedded in its walls, it's little wonder the building is considered one of the most haunted sites on the East Coast. Story 1. The Hallway Shadow. In the early 2000s, a paranormal team set up motion-activated cameras in one of the long second-floor corridors. Around 3:17 a.m., every camera recorded the same thing. A tall, shadow-like figure emerging from the far end of the hallway. It moved unnaturally, its legs making walking motions but not matching the speed of its glide. As it neared the camera, a light fixture overhead began to sway violently, though there was no draft. Just as it passed beneath, the lights went out entirely for 4 seconds. When power returned, the shadow was gone. Reviewing the footage later, the investigators noticed the shape had no facial features at all, only a blank, human-like silhouette. Story 2. The levitating tray. A former nurse who worked at St. Albans in the 1950s returned decades later for a tour. While standing in what used to be the patient cafeteria, she began telling the guide about a man who had refused to eat for days. As she spoke, a rusted serving tray on a nearby table began to lift into the air, tilting slightly before dropping with a deafening clang. Several witnesses saw it happen, including 2 tourists who were filming. The video captured the moment clearly. No strings, no one near it. The nurse broke down in tears, claiming the incident felt like that patient's spirit was letting her know he still wasn't eating. Story 3. The artillery echo. During an overnight investigation in the basement, 2 men reported hearing the distant boom of cannon fire. Thinking it might be a passing train or nearby construction, they ignored it until it happened again, louder and closer, accompanied by the metallic clink of musket balls hitting the floor. When they returned upstairs, other members of the team stationed outside swore they had heard nothing at all. Later research confirmed that during the Civil War, artillery units had camped directly on the hill where the sanatorium now stands. Some believe those soldiers never left forever, replaying the last battle they fought. Number 8. Bacon's Castle, Surrey. Standing since 1665, Bacon's Castle is one of the oldest brick structures in North America and a rare example of Jacobean architecture in the United States. Originally the home of prosperous planter Arthur Allen, the estate became infamous during Bacon's Rebellion of 1676, when rebel forces seized it as a stronghold. Over the centuries, the plantation was also the site of unimaginable suffering for enslaved men, women, and children. Whispers of brutal punishments, unmarked graves, and generations of hardship have stained the property's history, leaving an atmosphere that many say still feels heavy, oppressive, as though the past refuses to be forgotten. Story 1. The Shove. During a quiet afternoon tour, a visitor lingered behind in one of the upstairs bedrooms, examining the antique furniture. Without warning, they felt a forceful shove between the shoulder blades, sending them stumbling into a dresser. No one else was in the room. Later, the guide mentioned that many guests have reported the same experience, often in that exact spot, believed to be the work of an impatient spirit who dislikes intruders. Story 2. The Moving Tools. One autumn evening, while the castle was being prepared for a public haunt night, staff left a set of restoration tools on a table in the kitchen. Moments later, they returned to find the hammer and chisel neatly rearranged into the shape of a cross. Security cameras in the hallway showed no one entering or leaving the kitchen during that time. A historian later suggested it could be tied to an enslaved woman known for leaving protective symbols around the property, symbols meant to ward off evil. Story 3. The disembodied head. Perhaps the most unsettling legend comes from multiple witnesses over the years who claim to have seen the floating head of an African-American woman appear in darkened corners or reflected in windows. She never speaks, only stares before fading away. Local lore says she was a young enslaved woman who died under violent circumstances and whose body was never given a proper burial. Number 9. Crawford Road, Yorktown. There's a stretch of pavement in Yorktown, Virginia that looks ordinary enough at first glance. But when the sun sets and you creep underneath the bridge along Crawford Road, the stillness almost suffocates. Trees lean in like silent watchers. Your car's engine sputters. Your radio warps into a shriek that fractures the night. And if you're unlucky enough to glance in your rearview mirror, you might just catch the glint of a pair of eyes watching you vanish into the darkness. Welcome to Crawford Road. Colonial conflict, lynching myths, unsolved murders, and ghostly legends all tangled into 3.5 miles of unsettling asphalt. Crawford Road cuts through York County and Newport News, about 3.6 miles long and winding through dense woods, broken pavement, and gaps in streetlights. Like a scar across the landscape, Its surface is covered in graffiti, tire marks, and the accumulated weight of decades worth of stories. Its earliest layers echo with war. The land saw Revolutionary War and Civil War troop movements, a history still present in the air. Yet it's the tragedies of the 19th and 20th centuries that truly cement this road's macabre reputation. Locals whisper that during the era of Jim Crow, lynchings took place on the bridge. One story goes that a young black woman, either a runaway bride or the victim of vigilante violence, was hanged from the overpass. Since witnesses claim her ghost in a white dress haunts the bridge, sometimes appearing mid-swing, her body swaying as though time never freed her. But the road's real history is just as grim. In 1990, Jimmy Johnson disappeared after arranging a car sale. Weeks later, his body was found off of Crawford Road, shot with his hands bound with handcuffs and legs taped. The case resurfaced on America's Most Wanted, ultimately leading to a conviction. Additional similar deaths followed. In 1996, Eric Nesbitt, an airman, was murdered and his body dumped near the intersection of Tower Road. In 2000s and beyond, other cases, Tonya Lane, Austin Baxley, 2016, all added threads of unsolved or violent endings tied to this stretch. Then there are the accidents. Skid marks cover the underpass. Tires shredded. Local patrols have counted hundreds of wrecks. The road's secluded, narrow curves hide both literal and metaphorical dangers. Today, even skeptics tiptoe around it. York County historical figures and officials often dismiss the ghost stories, but admit the road's atmosphere and violent past make it one of the most notorious places in Virginia. Story 1. The Bride in White. In one of the most famous and chilling sightings, drivers have reported seeing a woman in a white wedding gown standing at the top of the bridge, her figure still and silent. One driver recounted how, while passing beneath, the urge to look back grew overwhelming. In the mirror, she said she saw the bride step off the ledge, then stop mid-fall, swaying as though hung by an invisible rope. Other stories describe that, after passing underneath, car engines suddenly die for no reason. Batteries drop dead. Radios malfunction. One report telling of a CD being shredded by a sudden, ear-piercing shriek that lasted 10 seconds, only to revert back to its original song afterward. These accounts span decades. Some survivors claim they were left shaken on the side of the road, feeling watched by an unseen presence. The bride's presence lingering in their ears and spine. Story 2. Handprints and red eyes. Another set of experiences involves ghostly handprints appearing on car windows, even freshly cleaned, one's moments after vehicles pass under the bridge. Small smudged prints that climb the glass, as though a child or small figure tried to reach inside. These appear alongside knocks, smearing sounds, and thuds. One pair of friends described hearing something hit the top of their windshield, trunk, then top of the car again, followed by fogged-up windows and vertical smear marks that slid down and dropped to the pavement. Then come the stories of red-eyed entities. In the stillness of the dark woods framing the road, some witnesses claim to have seen eyes red, glowing, peering through the trees. One Reddit account describes white dots suddenly appearing in the woods, followed by the sight of a tall, shadowy figure emerging, prompting the witness to run back to their car and pray. Such encounters are often accompanied by a visceral, instinctual fear, a warning to flee. Story 3. Screams, shadow figures, and aftermath during late-night ghost hunting adventures. A few chilling recordings and first-hand accounts stand out. One Reddit user recounted being out on the road at around 3 a.m. with a friend. Suddenly, they both heard a blood-curdling scream that froze them. No source, no explanation, just a scream echoing down the asphalt, driving them out of there in terror. Another visitor described pulling over beneath the bridge. The car shut off. Every light flickered. Then came the thud on the roof of their car, like something heavy hit it. When they exited to inspect, nothing was there. But witnesses often report a chilling moment when the presence isn't just felt, it makes itself heard. Still others whisper of shadowy figures emerging behind their headlights, shapes too human to be wild animals, but without features, just silhouettes flickering at the edge of the tree line or standing in the road. Not all come back. Some local teens say they never returned after an unexpected encounter. Others on Reddit describe an indescribable heaviness, an urge not to be seen out there, like the road knows when you've come to stay. Number 10. The Exchange Hotel Civil War Medical Museum, Gordonsville. The Exchange Hotel stands at the crossroads of American history, both literally and figuratively. Built in 1860, it was meant to be a luxury railroad hotel for travelers on the Virginia Central Railway. The three-story structure welcomed guests with fine dining, spacious rooms, and the bustle of a growing transportation hub. But when the Civil War erupted just a year later, its fate changed overnight. By 1862, the Confederate Army converted the building into the Gordonsville Receiving Hospital. Soldiers wounded at battlefields like Cedar Mountain, Chancellorsville, and the Wilderness were brought here by train. Over the next 3 years, The hospital treated more than 70,000 soldiers, both Confederate and Union prisoners of war. The lucky ones survived their wounds. The unlucky ones died in agony, their bodies laid out in rows until burial. Diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and smallpox swept through the wards, killing even more than the bullets and shrapnel. In 1865, after the war ended, the building became a Freedmen's Bureau hospital, offering medical care, food, and shelter to formerly enslaved African Americans. It was a place of hope, but also of hardship. Many who came here were starving, sick, or dying. Decades later, the building served as a boarding house and eventually fell into disrepair before being restored as the Exchange Hotel Civil War Medical Museum. Its walls have absorbed more than 150 years of suffering, healing, and death. And according to visitors, the people who never left still walk its halls. Story 1. The Woman in White. In 2012, a museum volunteer named Caroline was locking up for the night. As she moved through the second floor, once a surgical ward, she noticed movement in her peripheral vision. Standing at the far end of the hall was a woman in a white nurse's gown, her hands clasped in front of her. Caroline froze. The figure didn't speak, didn't move, just stared. When Caroline blinked, the woman was gone. The next morning, Caroline told the curator what she'd seen. Without hesitation, the curator pulled out an old black and white photo of Civil War nurses who had worked there. Caroline's knees went weak because one of the women in the photograph had the same face as the figure she saw. The nurse's name, according to records, was Clara Hathaway, and she had died in the hospital in 1863. Story 2. The soldier who wouldn't leave. A group of paranormal investigators set up equipment in what used to be the men's recovery ward. Around midnight, their thermal camera picked up a human-shaped heat signature sitting on one of the antique beds. They called out, "Can you tell us your name?" Through their audio recorder, a faint but distinct male voice responded, "James." When they reviewed Civil War records later, they found the name James W. Carter, a 19-year-old Confederate private, listed as having died in that very ward from a gunshot wound to the abdomen. Even stranger, one investigator swore he saw the shadowy figure stand up and walk toward the door. But when he followed, the hallway was empty except for the faint sound of boots marching down the stairs. Story 3. The basement touch. The basement of the Exchange Hotel is infamous among staff for being the most active and most unsettling part of the building. In 2018, a visitor named Mark went down alone during a daytime tour to see if the stories were true. He was halfway across the room when he felt a firm tap on his shoulder. Spinning around, he saw no one. He started walking again, only for the tapping to happen again, this time harder. He bolted upstairs. When he told the tour guide, she simply nodded and said, "You went into the old morgue area. That's where we kept the bodies before burial. They like to let you know you're not welcome."